colors were translated for the GBA and so on. But that Final Fantasy II, there was, for a very brief period of time, a prototype that was released in the US called Final Fantasy II. I think it was like Dark Skies Over Palakia was the subtitle, but it was never completed. And Jared, do you know the reason why that was never completed?
You know, you're getting into a realm that I just don't have a clue.
Well, it's good. It's a good thing you have me, the mega history and trivia nerd of Final Fantasy, to help you out with that question, Jared. So, so for Final Fantasy II, the main reason it wasn't released, and we'll play a little quick guessing game here about the main reason why it wasn't released. So, Jared, if you had never spoken to me about this before, and you didn't have the obsessive weirdo trivia nerd here to give you this information, what would be your best educated guess as to why Final Fantasy II was not released in the US until much later?
Is that they didn't have a person that could localize and translate the game for North America, would be my guess.
I mean, that's one pretty good guess. But then again, they had the almighty Ted Woolsey, who I'm sure we'll be talking about quite a bit more as we go on with this conversation. But the main reason I thought for a long time was that the original Final Fantasy, being an RPG, was kind of a niche genre. And RPGs, if you remember, back in the day, they weren't really like the biggest, most popular type of genre. If you remember, you talked earlier, Darren, about like being on the playground and what kids were talking about. What games were they talking about? Were they talking about Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy? No, they were talking
Absolutely not. Mario, Mega Man, Metroid, Contra, things like that.
Yeah, so my thought was the first one probably just didn't sell well enough here for Square to want to make the investment to localize it. But I did a little bit more digging and a little bit more research, and I found out that, and this is a fact that's going to, I think, blow a lot of people's minds, the original Final Fantasy on the NES actually sold better here in North America than it did in Japan. It was actually more popular here than it was over there. So then you have to kind of ask the question again, so why on earth did they not bring this game over? And you were kind of leaning in the right direction, saying they didn't have someone to localize it, because they did, but that process used to take a long, long time and be done in pieces. Because this was before the internet. There was no email, there was no forum, there was no, you couldn't very quickly do this sort of work. You couldn't assemble an international team of people to work together and collaborate. You had one guy, that was Ted Woolsey, communicating with the home office back in Japan via snail mail and getting pages of the script sent to him via the mail, which he would then translate and localize and then mail back. And then not only that, but then there was the technical aspect of it, where then they had to take these cartridges, these Nintendo cartridges that only had maybe 256 kilobytes of storage memory on them, and take all this data and convert it. And those limitations, Jared, I'm sure you remember, in the original Final Fantasy, how many letters could you have in a character name? Do you remember?
It wasn't much. Not off the top of my head, I can't remember how many, but I don't think it was more than 7.
Four letters in your character name. Because the Nintendo cartridges, especially back then, only had a very small amount of room for data. And doing these localizations, these translations, they would have to have enough room on that cartridge to put the new data in and remove the old data. It was a very tedious process. It took a very long time. It was very technically demanding for the time. And the original Final Fantasy, like we discussed earlier, that was released in Japan in 1987. We didn't see it until 1990. So given that, think about the time frame, right? So Final Fantasy II was released in December of 1988 in Japan. So if we're going through that same localization process with now a game with a much more developed story and a lot more text, use your imagination, Jared, and you tell me, why do you think, with all the information we have now, Why do you think, and the listener also, before Jared guesses, you guys take a guess too. Why do you think that it took years and years before we saw Final Fantasy II here in the US?
Giving the listeners a moment there. The answer to that, in my opinion, now will be that they just were too late. They didn't have time before the Super Nintendo was released.
And that is the $1,000,000 answer. They just didn't have time. The Super Nintendo was released in the US in, I think, late 91, right? By the time this game was
Yeah.
localized, the Super Nintendo would have already been out. And Nintendo didn't want to keep releasing more games for the NES. They were trying to phase it out and move everybody over to their new console, keep their business running, and make more money. So it was really just a timing issue. Now, I haven't played that Dark Skies over Palakia. I don't know if there's any, ROM image available of that. Thank you for listening to this clip from the Console Kingdom podcast. You can listen to the full episode right now here on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcasting platform. Links in the description below. Please like this video and subscribe and enable notifications so that you are notified when our next episode goes live. In the meantime, please check out my YouTube channel, Risky Bitness, right here on YouTube. Thank you, and game on.